Hi everyone. Welcome to this continuation of our discussion of the Pacific theater of the Second World War. Just give me a minute to talk about this poster. As you can see here, who do we see here? So it's obviously Japanese, and it might, of course, whenever we talk about sources like this, it's quite clear that there's a great likelihood that it's a propaganda poster. So we saw before that the Americans engaged in wartime propaganda like all the other powers, like all the other participants in this global conflict. So the Japanese did that as well. As you can see here, President Roosevelt depicted as what? President Roosevelt as representing the US as a nation. You see, he's depicted as a kind of monster. This reminds me of Beast from the X-Men or something like Frankenstein. So again, I come back to that point that participants in this conflict, they used all the possible tools at their disposal to get some advantage over their enemies, and at the same time to convince their populations that they were justified in waging war, that they were justified in being involved in this conflict, a conflict that, by the way, demanded a lot from the population, conflicts that at the same time, required vast amounts of resources. These resources had to be diverted towards the war effort. Okay, so the Japanese were no different. Okay, this was a strategy of war to depict your enemy as something other than human, so that it would be easier for you and for your followers to do what you needed to do. So something quite controversial. Just as the American decision to eventually drop two atomic bombs and wipe out thousands upon thousands of Japanese civilians in one instant, was also controversial and raises so many ethical questions. Now, we talked about the growing tensions between Japan and the US in the previous recording. Japan, wanting to build an empire, has a decision to make. So, Japan had to face a dilemma. Remember, they were quite successful in invading China. Nobody did anything. You know, the Chinese had to fight them, of course, but apart from that, the other powers just looked on. There were, on the part of Japan, economic concerns. Japan is not a resource rich country, always in need of resources. So, given that they were successful in invading Japan, and the Europeans were becoming busier and busier because of the Second World War, so Japan set its eyes on further prizes. The colonies and the territories controlled by the European powers like Burma under Great Britain, French Indochina, which, by the way, contained present-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and the Dutch East Indies, nowadays Indonesia. If Japan succeeds in carving out an empire, that would mean access to vast resources potentially provided by these territories: rice, oil, coal, rubber, and tin. So Japan's dilemma is, how do you do that? How do you establish an empire, given that there are powers that would probably react adversely, you know, to your actions? We're talking about the USSR and the US. President Roosevelt was clear-eyed about Japan's intentions. He saw that Japan wanted to, was becoming more aggressive and wanted to establish an empire in the Pacific. And it was clear to the US as well, to the US president, that that eventuality would threaten US interests in Asia because, the Americans had economic interests in China, they controlled the Philippines, and just, this concern about the Pacific in general. What if Japan became too powerful, was left unchallenged, then they would control the Pacific region. That's a great problem for the US. So the tensions between the US and Japan, they keep on growing. By 1941, remember that Germany invades the USSR, taking care of one of Japan's problems. So the USSR is going to be preoccupied with uh, German attacks, the German invasion. Now this, you know, opens up an opportunity for Japan. They invade French Indochina. They establish military bases there. Nobody does anything apart from the US. Not really a full-on war, but at least economic sanctions. They freeze Japanese assets. They cut supplies of iron. Very important if you're waging a war and if you're, maintaining your status as an industrial country. Embargo on oil supplies. So, but then Japan had to make a decision with regard to the US. Their idea was, the main objective was, what if you take out the Pacific Fleet, the American Pacific Fleet, in one strike, in one fell swoop? What if you're able to do that? And the expectation was, if Japan succeeds in doing that, then they would have they would have the time to build their empire, while the US, reeling from such an attack, would have to take time to recover. So this was, you know, Japan's understanding of the situation, and this was their objective. So what do? They launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, this military installation in Hawaii, which of course is part of the US. So the Japanese launched this attack, totally by the Americans were taken totally by surprise. The Japanese planes that that were used in this attack, they were totally undetected. So this happened on the 7th of December 1941, a date which Roosevelt in his address to Congress has called a date which will live in infamy. Will forever be remembered as this, as this sneak attack, as this dastardly act of on the part of the Japanese, and in effect, by the way, dragging the US into the war. So this brilliant attack was organized by Admiral Yamamoto, involved over 350 planes, um, attacking the US fleet, so battleships. But the main objective was really, one of the main objectives was to destroy the aircraft carriers of the US. Okay, but this had devastating results, in favor of the Japanese. You can see they were able to destroy so many aircraft, US aircraft, 350, destroyed 5 of the 8 battleships, moored um, at Pearl Harbor, and then caused 3,700 casualties, American casualties. But fortunately for the US, the Japanese made crucial mistakes here. Although the Americans were completely taken by surprise, um, the Japanese failed in their biggest objective, which was to destroy the carriers and to to totally disable and to neutralize the American fleet in the Pacific. So the Japanese weren't able to destroy the aircraft carriers of the US, and they didn't look for them. They didn't hunt them down. Also, at the same time, the shoreside facilities of the US remained intact. The facilities at Pearl Harbor, crucially, their fuel depots were unharmed, and so this fact facilitated the rescue and the recovery of the US. So they were able to bounce back relatively quickly, even after this attack. So, what were the results of Pearl Harbor? Japan would be, at least for a time, master of the Pacific. The very next day, the US declares war on Japan. So they're now part of the action. They're now, explicitly and officially, involved in the Second World War. And then a few days later, Germany declares war on the US. It's debatable. Maybe this was a mistake on the part of Germany to declare war on the US. Why? Because, you know, involvement in a conflict against the Japanese was easier to justify after Pearl Harbor. But then involvement, a more explicit, a more obvious and a deeper involvement in the conflict in Europe, that could have been a harder task for Roosevelt, to justify that before the rest of the American government and the American public. Again, you see here another propaganda poster, American, of course, part of the effort to convince the public that, you know, it was in their interest and they had the duty to fight the Japanese. So that's at the same time a picture of Admiral Yamamoto, who designed the attack on Pearl Harbor. As we end this current discussion, let me just show you a couple of things. Another cartoon, you know, obviously could be called propaganda, but at the same time, this the involvement of the Americans against the Japanese in a conflict against the Japanese. This had effects on the Japanese American population, you know, increasingly seen as traitors to the country, and these Japanese Americans would be forced to go into internment camps in the US. No. On the other hand, I just want to point this out. This graphic novel by Shigeru Mizuki is also a great one. It's called Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths. It's about Japanese soldiers, ordinary Japanese soldiers, having to fight this war in the Pacific against the Americans. So at least in this graphic novel, they get to tell their own side, their side of the story. Okay. So what's good about this graphic novel is that in contrast to, for instance, this political cartoon where all these Asiatic people, these Japanese people, Japanese Americans are portrayed as looking all the same, indistinguishable from the rest. Here, the Japanese are drawn in such a way that, they're depicted as real people, as real individuals. So there it is. We'll continue this discussion in the next recordings. I'll see you there.